You mentioned one university that was actually had its own satellites.
Yeah, yeah. When it comes to new research, instead of working in collaboration with a NASA, for example, they just give the school the budget and they say, build your own satellites.
Right. Let me ask you this. So many people in America, I still hear this. I hear this constantly. They say, yeah, you know, the Chinese, they can copy, but they can't innovate. And even Bill Gates said, well, there's a certain timeline to everything, right? There's a certain learning curve. And he said, in time, he believes China will be a great innovation center. And to a degree, it's already kind of starting. So what do you think? Do you think that they're always going to remain just the copycatters of the world? Or you think because of this is one aspect of kind of this, you know, there's the money's there. Do you think they're trying to think forward and they will be a leading innovation?
I do. I mean, make no mistake, I still think that the U.S. is the innovation capital of the world. I think that, you know, between Silicon Valley and our top universities, we're still producing some of the top research, of course, especially when we're talking about medical,
right.
Technology, IT. We're still at the top.
Right.
But that gap is narrowing.
Right.
And I think that China, especially as it sends so many students to the U.S.
They're learning
to study, right? And they're coming on national scholarships.
Right.
China knows that they want to send students over, educate them, let them work for 10 years, bring them back to China, and bring what they've learned with them. The U.S. needs to do the same thing. We need to learn what China's doing. We need to learn what Europe's doing.
And you don't see that happening?
Well, just at a much slower rate and a much smaller scale. I mean, if we look at some universities in Asia, they might be trying to send 20-30% abroad. We look in Europe, that can be even as high as 70-80% of students are required to do a semester abroad. They're required to do internships with an international company, things like this. U.S., we're looking at more like 5%,
right.
10%, if they're lucky.
Right. You know, just FYI, a lot of those scientists that you see that are actually the brain power in Silicon Valley, they're brought in on H-1B1 visas, right? And I know this because I have friends that work in several of these large companies that I've talked to, and the majority of the people that are working in these companies are Chinese and Indian, right? Brought in, imported in, right? So the genius visa, what we call in the U.S. H-1B1 visa, the most intellectual visa, and so I think what I'm kind of hearing now is as things improve and these countries, you're seeing kind of somewhat of a reverse brain drain where these people are going back and starting with their own Silicon Valleys and their own companies.
And India is another force to be reckoned with. I think it was, don't quote me on this, but I think it was the New York Times top 100 universities. The biggest improvement was in India.
Yeah.
Universities are coming up fast.
Yeah, I think 60 Minutes in 2003 they did a segment on the IIT's Indian Institute of Technology. They said there's something like, I believe it was like a Harvard they said MIT and a Yale put together. Something on that level. So almost like the MIT was a fallback because the IITs were so elite. At that point in time in 2003, there were 6 of them. Now there's 16 of them. So these are just probably the best engineering colleges in the world.
Yeah, they're doing really well. I think that in the U.S. we've got a lot of room for improvement. But one of the areas that I think, and this isn't just the U.S., a lot of countries are struggling with this right now, is this concept of high school becoming undergraduate and undergraduate becoming graduate. And I'm talking about what's required as a basic level of education. 20-30 years ago, a high school degree was enough to get you a decent job for a middle class income.
Right.
Nowadays, an undergraduate degree can barely do that.
Right.
I think part of the problem is that we don't we don't understand our kids well enough to
Mhm.
place them in the right type of education.
Right.
And that's from K to 12, higher education, all the way through PhD.
Mhm.
I've met too many PhD students that finish their thesis and they say, I'm not even interested in what I do anymore.
Really?
Yeah, and I think that we don't stop the process of education enough to say, is the student on the right track
Mhm.
based on their innate skills, what
Mhm.
their interests are?
Right.
We do very little of that in our school system, I think, whether it's university or primary.
Well, I think a lot of it starts in primary and then secondary, and again, one of I think the greatest problems with the U.S. system. There's a lot of them, but probably the number one greatest problem is that all kids are going to